We're here with Dr. Michael Provence, Associate Professor of History at the University of California in San Diego. We'll be talking about Syria particularly and the region in general. Michael, tell me a little bit about the background of Syria. You know, after the father died and the son came in, who's now the current leader, to give me a sense of where this revolt, where the wellsprings of the revolt occurred.
Yeah. Well, when Hafiz al-Assad died in 1999, his son, Bashar al-Assad, who wasn't really the chosen son, but the second son, who had been an ophthalmologist in training in London, had been sort of getting groomed for a few years. But people didn't really take him seriously until suddenly the father died in the summer of '99. And he was sort of immediately thrust into the presidency. There was a constitutional amendment. The vice president stepped aside, and suddenly he was president. And it was a kind of I mean, I was living in Syria at the time, and his death, the death of the father, was a big surprise. The emergence of the son was not a surprise, and there was a kind of a perception among people that the future was really worrisome. And once the succession took place, people kind of relaxed. And, you know, there was some continuity. I mean, Syrians, I think, like people in the region generally, saw the Lebanese Civil War. They had seen other kinds of regional conflagrations, and were really worried about instability and chaos at the top. So he had a kind of an easy time, Bashar al-Assad, as he became the president at 34. And the impression I had was that he immediately began to use this relief on the part of the population to kind of ease things up, to release prisoners. He closed a prison. There was a period that was called the Damascus Spring that took place. This was 2000. This was the fall and spring, fall of 2000, the spring of 2001. And dissidents began to, there was a free newspaper, that is to say a non-governmental newspaper, and people embraced this. And the impression was, among many people, and myself included, was that he was using his popularity with the public as a weapon against elements of his father's government. People who were still lurking around in the shadows, people who were in charge of the security agencies, people who had been high-ranking military officers who were back there getting ready or preparing to pull strings. And he used his popularity as a weapon against those people. But within a year, once he was firmly ensconced, the repression began again, and people began to be rounded up. The discussion forums were closed down. Some of the liberalizing reforms were changed, but the reforms that were not changed had to do with capitalism, with freeing capital, with privatizing certain things, and stuff along those lines. And so there emerged over the coming years a kind of a new class of, we could say, crony capitalists of his generation, who emerged and kind of gutted the ideological component of the previous nationalist, socialist government that his father had stood for.
You talk about capitalism. During this period of the sun and liberalizing capitalism, was the country open to foreign investment? Could you talk about that a little bit?
It had not been. And I mean, the Syrian economy was a closed economy over the 30 years of Hafiz al-Assad's rule. His son opened it, but opened it to people who were connected. And so, for example, there was a hotel built in downtown Damascus, the Four Seasons, which was built with money that came from the Gulf. It was built with money from Walid bin Talal, the financier. And it was built on the grounds of what had been a public park and a Mamluk tomb complex. So these public properties were destroyed to make a kind of a new monument to what we can call crony capitalism. And this was, I think, emblematic of the kind of reforms that took place. People who were close to the top became wealthy, and an entire new strata of kind of conspicuous consumption emerged on the part of people who were close to the government. The most notorious example, of course, is the cousin of the president himself, Rami Makhlouf, who received the cell phone concession and became the richest person in the country, and essentially controlled or does control virtually the entire economy.
So are you saying that there's no Western money, no European money, no American investment, no Citibank in Syria?
Well, there isn't much. I mean, the money that has flowed into the country has been from Gulf investors. It's not like, say, for example, the Gulf states like Kuwait or Qatar that are fully integrated into the world economy, that have giant state stock portfolios, things like that. I mean, Syria is a poor country, and during the 30 years of Hafez al-Assad's rule, the economic engine of the country was agriculture, and it remains agriculture. And because of the nationalist, socialist, Ba'athist ideology of the government, and because of the rural origins of the ruling stratas, Hafez al-Assad and the people around him, the countryside did pretty well. And the countryside was electrified, there were good schools, there were hospitals, stuff like that. And that was part of the ideology of rule. And conspicuous consumption, I mean, there was a lot of corruption, but it wasn't the kind of corruption that we see today. Today the corruption is huge transfers of wealth from the public treasury or control of capital from the public treasury to these selected individuals and people close to them. In those days, it was different. It was corruption of the military structures, but the people would say that the living standard of Syrians in the 90s, in the 80s, was uniform and uniformly low. Today, you see Maseratis on the streets of Damascus, or in the past 10 years, and this is actually sort of a shock. It's a shock, and it's a grievance to people within the country who are not prospering. And in those rural regions and places, in fact, precisely the places that have been most involved in the uprising over the last year, those are the places that have suffered and declined in economic prosperity over the past decade, as this kind of transfer has gone from supporting the countryside, supporting the pillars of legitimacy of the state, to enriching a select number of people who are hooked up and close to the government.
Let's talk a little bit more about the uprising and the aggrieved. Is it more workers and peasants who are impoverished? Is it more the intellectual class? Or is it across class lines, this uprising that we're seeing now?
Well, would-be workers. I think well, I'll tell you I'll give you an example. I have a friend who lives in Dara, which is where the uprising began, and we haven't been able to contact him since the beginning. And I was talking with another friend who knows this guy well, and he's a prosperous farmer. Reasonably prosperous farmer in this region. So he owns some land, and he has a pretty nice house, and he has a car, a truck actually, a farming truck. So this is, by Syrian standards, this is a pretty prosperous farmer. Now, we were talking about him, my friend and I, and he said, well, we don't have to worry about him because he's too old to protest, and his children are too young. So in this way, we have precisely identified the strata of the people who are most likely to be out in the streets, who are high school students, college-age students, people who are frustrated, unemployed, who have aspirations to some kind of material prosperity and yet cannot leave their parents' homes because they can't earn enough money or even find jobs to go and make it on their own. And the population has increased rapidly. Population growth is very high. And so these people are educated, literate, cosmopolitan, watching satellite news stations, and have quite a lot of knowledge about the outside world, and yet really have their aspirations stunted by what they think are the limited possibilities delivered by the government. I think this is the operative group. Now there is a kind of a traditional oppositional intellectual group or class within Damascus, within Aleppo, people who have been opposed to the government. Many of them have served time in jail. Some of these people are in their 80s, even older. So those people are still around too. But the people who are really out in the streets every day, day after day, are people in their teens and 20s and maybe early 30s.
In the very early stages, were these people organized enough to bring specific grievances to the government, and if so, what was the government's response before we get to the stage we're seeing now on television?
Yeah. Yes, they were. I mean, the grievances were the same grievances that we've seen elsewhere in the period of from late 2010 through 2011 in Egypt and Libya, in Bahrain, in Yemen, and other places. The demands were articulated in the first instance, I think, by people who were veteran activists who had spent time in prison, who were sophisticated and pointed in their criticisms, but they were adopted by people who were protesting in the streets, who in some cases had never even known that those dissidents, those oppositional intellectuals even existed, but they coalesced at this moment in early 2011, in February and March. The demands were an end to the emergency law, which is effective martial law in Syria.
How long has the emergency law been?
It's been in effect since 1963. And emergency law in Syria and emergency law elsewhere is actually colonial martial law. So it's a kind of I mean, there was a period between 1948 or 1946 when Syria was independent from France to 1963, where emergency law was not constantly in action. But emergency law is simply a evolution, a legal development of martial law imposed by the colonial regime. It's the same in Israel and Palestine. Many of the laws that enable house demolitions, for example, are actually British mandate colonial law codes that still exist. And so in Syria, it's very much the same. So this emergency law essentially denies all of the constitutional guarantees that that citizens, ordinary citizens, should enjoy. And so the demand was rights of citizenship in our own country, an end to the emergency law, democratic transition, a multi-party elections, and the rule of law, simply stated. Very simple, and based on, I mean, it's a very pointed critique because these are things the government claims to be doing anyway. So the structures of these legal structures exist, but they're not respected by the government in the same way that they were not respected by the colonial governments that preceded these post-colonial governments.
And when these demands were presented to the government, what was their response?
We can talk. We're studying it, but this has gone on for 11 years actually. We need more time. It takes time. We don't want to develop or to change is important. We must change. We know we have to change, but we have to do it at our own pace. It can't be driven by outside demands. And then finally, in March, late March, there was a speech given by the president, which really was the crucial turning point, where President Bashar al-Assad, denounced people who had been protesting as traitors, basically, and people who had to be crushed by the power of the state, and that the movement was a foreign conspiracy by which, of course, he means foreign conspiracy motivated or out of the impetus of the United States and Israel. And this was a kind of an insult to people who had been protesting. And this really sort of severed, I think, the last, or undermined the legitimacy of the president and the state. And this was a year ago now, the end of March 2011.
Internationally, who are Syria's friends, and how does that play out in what's going on?
Russia and Iran. But I mean, this is a shifting cast of characters. Russia and Iran, however, are the two constants in Syrian geopolitics. Since, in the case of Russia, since the 60s, the mid-60s, and in the case of Iran, since the Iranian Revolution or even before. Syria had contacts with the people who became the revolutionaries in Iran even before the revolution. And Syria was an opponent of the government in Iraq, which was actually, of course, after the revolution, a kind of an ally of the United States. So there was a geopolitical kind of a chessboard. The Syrians were with the Soviets, they were with the Iranian revolutionaries, and they were against the United States, Israel, and the conservative monarchies of the Gulf. And to some extent, this hasn't changed too much. The Syrians are still very close to Iran. People who claim that this has something to do with religion don't know what they're talking about. It has nothing to do with the religious component of the various governing structures. It's about geopolitics and national interests and a relationship, a 30-year-old relationship based on mutual interest and mutual trust, probably, at the highest echelons of the Syrian and Iranian government.
What we see on television is brutal. Here we are in the spring, and the images on television from, is it Hama? Is that the
Hama?
Hama?
Homs.
Yeah, it's a repeat of what the father had done, only with more modern weapons, I suppose. And there's talk of NATO, there's talk of intervention and so on. And some people say we should do it to save lives. Other people say if we do it, it's the West going into another country in the Middle East and so on. Talk to us about that, if you can.
Well, in 1982, and in the preceding several years, from the mid-late 70s, there was an insurgency in Syria led by the Muslim Brotherhood against the government of Hafez al-Assad. Hafez al-Assad's government had been popular, relatively, but the Muslim Brotherhood opposed it on religious grounds, on political grounds, and began a kind of a campaign of assassination and not exactly armed uprising, but sort of various outrages against the government and leading figures within the government. In 1982, the Muslim Brotherhood barricaded itself within Hama, this fourth largest Syrian city behind Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. Hama is and declared it a free city. The Syrian government launched an assault on the city, sealed it, which is sort of the standard practice for them. They sealed the city, they cut off electricity, they cut off phone service, they cut off water, sealed the city, and then besieged it and destroyed the central area of the city and killed some tens of thousands of citizens, including probably some who were armed insurgents of the Muslim Brotherhood. Declared the membership in the Muslim Brotherhood a crime punishable by death, and like I say, destroyed the city with artillery, airstrikes, and then ground troops in the city. The troops were led by the president's brother, a man named Rafat al-Assad, who later was expelled from the family in a way and is in exile in London now. Not because of what he did then, although it was related. He was in a way punished as a kind of a scapegoat for the repression, but also because he challenged his brother's rule within the country. So in 1984, he went into exile. The echoes with today are intense. Rifat al-Assad was in charge of the special forces of the Syrian army, this sort of elite group that carried out this. It was not the regular army. And today, Mahar al-Assad, the younger brother of the current president, Bashar al-Assad, is in charge of these same sorts of special forces that are in charge of the most brutal kinds of repression within the country today, these elite forces. But there were differences too. I mean, then the Muslim Brotherhood uprising was limited to these one cities, and the tactics were kind of terror tactics, and it was not broadly popular. Today, there was a peaceful movement of demonstrations that was kind of challenged immediately with appalling state violence. So it's a different kind of a movement. A peaceful movement, a movement of broad-based opposition. And finally, the government, as far as we know, has not used really heavy weaponry against these cities, except for artillery. No airstrikes, maybe helicopter gunships, but not very much. The devastation is shocking, but it's nothing like what a modern military could do if it really wanted to destroy cities. I mean, this is a sort of a thing that people who are appalled and outraged by the violence of the Syrian government don't acknowledge. That the government is actually not unleashing everything against these cities. If they did, the cities would be totally destroyed and all the population would be killed. And that is not the case. But in Hama, in 1982, in the space of 2 days, the government killed more people than have been killed in the entire year since this uprising. Now, so the tactics are different. The outcomes are a bit different, and the contours of the confrontation are different, because this uprising is much more popular and much broader and much more threatening in a way to the legitimacy of the government than the Muslim Brotherhood uprising of 1982.
You say it's broader. Let's talk about that a minute. I mean, is there a way to assess how broad it really is? In other words, within Syrian society, there are those who will back the president and those who will back the resistance. Yeah. How does that fall in your scholarship in terms of numbers and so on? How popular is this popular uprising?
Well, I think it's very hard to say. I mean, nobody can really say. And I think that people who would claim to be able to quantify these kinds of percentages are not, it's not credible. Now, there is a sectarian component which has been exploited very effectively by the state, by the government, which is to say that the uprising is based on Islamist criminals and foreign conspiracies from the Gulf, by Islamic extremists. The government is composed in its top echelon of people who are members of a sectarian minority, a kind of a quasi-Islamic sectarian minority in Syria. And there's a large Christian population which has been usually supportive of the government. The government has made the case repeatedly, at the very beginning, that the uprising is not people with legitimate grievances for citizenship, armed criminal Islamist terrorists, and that that only the government chaos, disorder, and with percent of the population, this is a compelling argument. The government has succeeded terrifying people so that they support the government because they believe the opposition is worse. So the opposition or the protest movement did not start out as a sectarian. I don't think it's a sectarian movement today. There are Islamists within it, that's for sure. But every sectarian minority also represented. opposition politicians, and even so that there are, you know, people, hundreds of thousands of people have demonstrated, millions have demonstrated in opposition to the government here repeatedly, at risk of mortal pain. And probably thousands of people have demonstrated in favor of the government. No risk, actually, to them. And in some cases, they were compelled for reasons of their vocation or whatever. I mean, it's well known that you get a holiday and all the kids are expected to go out on the streets for the president. Everybody knows this. It's a formative duty that Syrians are to. Does this mean that they support the government? I mean, to know risks something. So there's a here. The percentage of people who support the government under any circumstance and believe everything is small. You know, the people who are have benefited in significant ways. I mean, who have become literally millionaires in the last 10 years. And of course, for these people, the government is extremely. They may not have Swiss bank bank accounts, and yet wealthy within Syria. They're deeply committed. People, we're talking about the high-ranking military officers, people who are these crony capitalists and so on. These people are deeply committed to the government. They must be. They have to be. They are not all Alawi, not by any means. There are many Christians, Sunnis. They're representative of all religious groupings within the country.
Professor Provence, thanks so much for your comments. We look forward to speaking with you again for part 2.
Thank you.